Eleanor had always lived a life marked by quiet routines and soft memories, her days flowing gently with the rhythm of her own company, the ticking clock, and the occasional phone call from distant friends, but tonight felt different, though she could not say why. The air seemed heavier, almost waiting, as she prepared a small cup of tea and settled into her favorite armchair, the one near the window where she could watch the garden shadows lengthen, and just as she was lost in the comfort of her own solitude, a soft, hesitant knock on the door startled her, not because she feared visitors, but because she had grown accustomed to the silence that had become a loyal companion over the years, and when she opened it, there stood her grandson Daniel, tall now, his shoulders slightly slouched as if carrying invisible weight, his hands buried nervously in his jacket pockets, his eyes searching hers for some unspoken permission, and she immediately sensed that this was no ordinary visit. No simple stop-in, there was urgency in his quiet presence, a tension that filled the air with a kind of fragile suspense, the kind that made a person hold their breath without realizing it, and as he stepped inside, murmuring a polite "Hi, Grandma," Eleanor noticed the tremor in his voice, small but undeniable, a hint that he carried something heavy that he had been holding back for far too long, and when she invited him to sit, they chose the living room, a space that had once echoed with his childhood laughter, the sound of toy cars rolling across the rug, and memories of bedtime stories and shared secrets flickered across her mind, making the room feel both warm and achingly empty at the same time, as if the past and present were colliding gently, waiting for his words to bridge the distance between them. Daniel sat down carefully, shoulders tense, eyes downcast for a moment before he lifted them to meet hers, and there it was, the unspoken question in his gaze, the silent plea. That said he needed more than a casual conversation, that this moment was important, maybe even life-altering, and Eleanor felt a familiar tightening in her chest, the same she remembered from years ago when her own heart had been on the brink of confession or loss, and she realized that whatever he was about to say was going to change the atmosphere of the room, shift the familiar landscape of their lives, because Daniel, for all his youthful energy, carried a depth of emotion she had never fully seen before, a mix of fear, longing, and honesty that made the very walls of her home seem to lean in and listen, and when he finally broke the silence with a quiet, hesitant "Grandma, can we really talk?" the words landed like soft raindrops, gentle but insistent, and Eleanor nodded, heart fluttering, hands gripping her knees, because she knew, instinctively, that this conversation would not just be about passing thoughts or fleeting feelings, it would be about truths too heavy to ignore. About emotions carefully tucked away, and about the human need to be seen and understood, and as Daniel began to take a slow, steadying breath, preparing to share what he had carried silently inside for so long, Eleanor felt the air shift, charged with anticipation, as if the room itself was holding its breath along with her, waiting for the first word that would open the door to something bigger, something raw and real, a dialogue that would pull them closer and leave an imprint on both their hearts, and in that delicate, suspended moment, Eleanor realized that life often whispers in small, quiet knocks at the door, and tonight, the whisper had arrived in the form of her grandson, ready to speak, ready to reveal, ready to change everything in ways she could not yet imagine. Daniel's words began slowly, each one measured as if he were stepping carefully on stones over deep, unseen waters, and Eleanor listened with a quiet patience, sensing the weight of emotions he had carried for so long, emotions that had been buried under fear and uncertainty, a longing for connection, and a need to be understood, and as he spoke, he admitted that he often felt invisible, overlooked, as if the world expected him to move through life following paths others had chosen, paths that offered safety but left no room for the heart to speak freely, and he described a love that had quietly grown in the corners of his life, a love that frightened him because it demanded honesty he wasn't sure he could give, a love that made him vulnerable in a way he had never felt before, and Eleanor's chest tightened as she realized that her grandson, so young in years yet so old in feeling, carried burdens she had only glimpsed from afar, a mixture of fear, hope, and desire that pressed on him silently, shaping his days and nights, his laughter and his quiet moments alone, and she remembered her own youth, a life punctuated by hidden affections and unspoken truths, when she had loved deeply but feared the consequences of being fully seen, when she had let opportunities slip because the heart demanded courage she could not summon, and as Daniel continued, he confessed the small, daily struggles of being who he truly was while navigating a world that seemed to reward conformity, the moments when he longed for guidance but hesitated to speak, fearing judgment or misunderstanding, and Eleanor felt a bittersweet mix of pride and sorrow, seeing in him both the reflection of her younger self and the promise of someone willing to face the truth even when it hurt, and she reached for her own memories, telling herself to stay silent for now, to let him fill the space with his story without interruption, to honor the trust in his presence and the courage it took to reveal so much at once. And as he described nights of quiet desperation, days of pretending, and fleeting moments of joy tinged with fear, Eleanor's mind drifted to the countless small ways life teaches resilience, the silent lessons learned through heartbreak and hope, and she thought about how Daniel's honesty, though raw and unpolished, held a beauty and bravery that many never attain, a willingness to face the self honestly, to name what had been unnamed, and in that living room, filled with shadows and memories, the connection between them deepened, a thread woven from shared humanity, from the recognition that pain and longing, love and fear, could coexist yet still lead to growth, and Daniel's voice wavered as he spoke of the person he had begun to love quietly, the ache of wanting to share that love yet fearing the unknown, and Eleanor felt the familiar sting of regret, remembering all the times she had held back her own heart, realizing that guidance in these moments was both delicate and profound, that words spoken with care could either heal or overwhelm, and she decided in that instant to listen fully, to offer her presence as a safe harbor for his confessions, and as Daniel paused, eyes glistening, Eleanor reached out and took his hand gently, a small, grounding gesture that said, without words, that he was not alone, that the truth could be faced, that love, even when complicated and frightening, was not something to be hidden but something to be met with courage and compassion, and as he took a slow, shuddering breath, Eleanor could sense the shift, a soft unfolding of relief, of being understood, and she realized that the room, filled with the echoes of childhood laughter, the ticking clock, and the quiet creaks of the old house, now held a new rhythm, one of honesty and emotional awakening, one that promised that while the world outside might remain complicated and uncertain, here, in this fragile space between grandmother and grandson, words could transform fear into strength, longing into clarity, and unspoken truths into bonds that might carry them both toward a future less shadowed by doubt and more illuminated by understanding. And as Daniel finally leaned back, exhausted yet lighter, Eleanor sat quietly, heart swelling with empathy and admiration, knowing that this conversation, begun in nervous hesitation, had already begun to reshape not just his path but hers, teaching her again that listening, truly listening, was an act of love, that vulnerability could be a bridge, and that the honesty shared in that living room tonight would ripple forward, quietly, persistently, into the lives of both of them, leaving marks that would not fade. And as the evening light dimmed, spilling gold across the rug where Daniel once played, Eleanor felt the gentle, profound weight of transformation beginning, subtle yet irreversible, like the first breath of spring after a long winter, fragile but full of promise, and in that moment, she understood that love, in all its forms, had found a way to speak, and that hearing it, truly hearing it, was the first step toward everything changing. Eleanor's voice trembled slightly as she began to speak, not because she lacked confidence, but because the weight of her own memories pressed against her chest, memories that had been folded away carefully over decades, moments of love and longing that she had once thought could be ignored, and now, in the presence of her grandson Daniel, those memories felt alive again, as if the room itself leaned closer to hear her story, and she began to tell him about Thomas, a man she had loved deeply in her youth, a love that had bloomed quietly, tenderly, full of promises whispered under starlight and dreams shared in secret, yet a love that had been interrupted by fear, by choices made to protect the fragile heart she carried, choices that had led to years of solitude filled with what-ifs and echoes of a happiness that might have been, and Daniel listened, eyes wide, leaning forward, as if every word Eleanor spoke was a key unlocking parts of her soul he had never seen, parts shaped by joy and heartbreak, by courage and retreat, by moments of pure connection and painful separation, and she described the nights when she had waited for Thomas to return, the letters she had written but never sent, the walks she had taken hoping to catch a glimpse of what could have been, and in her voice was a mixture of sorrow and wisdom, a gentle warning that love could be both beautiful and fragile, that it could teach lessons even when it ended in absence, and Daniel felt a strange warmth and ache in his chest, recognizing in her story echoes of his own hidden feelings, the longing to speak truths he had kept locked away, the fear of rejection, the hope that vulnerability could still bring understanding, and Eleanor's eyes softened as she reached across and touched his hand briefly, a gesture that spoke louder than any lecture, louder than any advice, because it said, without interruption, that she understood, that she had been there too, that courage and honesty could be born from heartbreak. And Daniel's lips parted slightly as he absorbed each word, the living room seeming to shrink around them, filled only with their presence, the hush of history, the tension of unspoken emotions now shared, and she continued, telling him that even when life had forced her to step away from Thomas, she had carried the lessons of that love forward, learning that the heart's truths were more valuable than comfort, that silence could heal but also suffocate, and that there was a rare strength in allowing oneself to feel fully, to confront fear, and to act with honesty even when the outcome was uncertain. And as she spoke, Daniel realized that he had never heard anyone explain love like this, not in books, not in movies, not in passing conversations. This was raw, lived experience, shaped by time and patience, and he felt a sudden clarity, a quiet awakening, as if Eleanor's words were a light piercing the fog of his own confusion, illuminating paths he had been too afraid to see. And Eleanor, noticing the shift in his expression, smiled faintly, a mixture of pride, relief, and bittersweet recognition, because she understood that telling her story now, decades later, was not just a confession but a gift, a guide for the young man sitting across from her, someone who needed reassurance that love, though complicated and sometimes painful, was worth embracing, worth speaking, worth living fully. And Daniel's eyes glistened as he nodded, small movements betraying the impact her words had on him, and Eleanor encouraged him gently, reminding him that mistakes, heartbreak, and uncertainty were all parts of the journey, that courage was not absence of fear but the choice to move forward despite it. And she shared little anecdotes of Thomas's humor, his small kindnesses, the way he had listened deeply and loved without conditions, painting a picture that was vivid, emotional, and real. And Daniel felt the room fill with the warmth of possibility, the realization that even love lost or deferred could teach strength, empathy, and self-knowledge, that life's lessons often came dressed in heartache but were infused with profound meaning. And he leaned back slightly, a slow, steady exhale leaving him, as if some of the weight he carried had lifted, leaving room for hope and understanding to take root. And Eleanor, observing this subtle change, felt a quiet satisfaction, knowing that her honesty had opened a door, that her words might guide him through his own fears, and that the bond between them had grown in ways neither could yet fully measure, forming a connection built not just on shared blood but on shared humanity, on lessons of love, heartbreak, and resilience. And as the evening shadows lengthened across the room, stretching over the rug that still held echoes of Daniel's childhood laughter, Eleanor realized that life had a way of circling back, of allowing truths long held to finally be spoken, and that in this moment, her story had become a bridge, a way for Daniel to see that love could be pursued with courage, that the heart's desires were valid, that honesty was liberating, and that the quiet moments of reflection, the confessions, and the gentle guidance of those who had lived before him could shape his path in ways he might never forget. And Daniel, sitting with her, absorbing every word, felt the first stirrings of confidence, a willingness to confront his own fears, to name the emotions he had long buried, to acknowledge the love that had scared him. And Eleanor watched this transformation unfold with a mixture of tenderness and awe, understanding that their conversation, begun in hesitance and trepidation, was now a pivotal moment. Not just a sharing of past regrets and wisdom but a quiet promise that honesty, empathy, and love could change everything. And as the night deepened, with the soft hum of the heating and the distant chirping of crickets outside, Eleanor felt a profound sense of fulfillment, knowing that her story had reached him, that Daniel had felt its weight in beauty, that he now carried a spark of courage she had longed to give him, and that this exchange, intimate, heartfelt, and patient, had the power to guide him, heal him, and prepare him for the choices and loves yet to come. And as they sat together, hands touching lightly, hearts connected in shared understanding, Eleanor sensed that the bridge they had built in this living room, with words honest and emotions bare, would remain, quietly strong, ready to support them both as life moved forward. And Daniel, finally speaking with a calmness he had not known before, thanked her in a whisper, knowing that her story had not just illuminated the past but had offered him the courage to face his own future, and Eleanor, smiling softly, realized that moments like these were rare and precious, that love and guidance could flow across generations when hearts were willing to listen and share, and as the night wrapped them in its gentle quiet, both felt a new sense of connection, a promise of understanding, and a hope that the honesty of this conversation would ripple through the choices, relationships, and loves that lay ahead, leaving marks of wisdom, compassion, and courage that neither would ever forget. As Daniel stood to leave, the air between him and Eleanor felt charged with something unspoken, a quiet tension that carried both hope and uncertainty. The kind of energy that lingers after truths have been shared and hearts have been exposed, and Eleanor noticed the subtle changes in his posture, the way his shoulders seemed a little lighter, the way his gaze held a mixture of reflection and determination, a sign that her words, his own confessions, and the intimacy of their conversation had begun to settle into something meaningful, something that could not be undone, and she felt a surge of both relief and bittersweet emotion, understanding that these moments of connection, though brief, were transformative, carrying the power to reshape perspectives and heal old wounds. And as Daniel approached the door, he paused, turning back toward her with a vulnerability that made Eleanor's chest ache, the vulnerability of someone who had trusted enough to lay bare the core of their being, and in that pause, he whispered a quiet thank you, his voice barely audible but laden with gratitude, and Eleanor, her eyes glistening with the reflection of years lived and lessons learned, nodded softly, knowing that gratitude alone could not capture the depth of the exchange, that the words, the emotions, and the courage shared tonight had created something far more enduring, a bridge between generations, a space where truth was honored, and love, even in its complicated and sometimes painful forms, had found a way to flourish, subtly, gently, but undeniably. And as the door closed behind him, Eleanor remained in the living room. Alone but not lonely, the silence now alive with the echoes of laughter, tears, confessions, and the soft, steady pulse of life that had been stirred by Daniel's honesty and her own recollections, and she realized that life had a way of presenting moments that demanded courage, that offered clarity in the midst of uncertainty, and that left an imprint on the soul in ways that time could never erase. And she thought about the lessons that had been shared tonight. The importance of speaking truth, even when it is frightening, the value of listening fully and without judgment, the power of empathy to connect hearts across ages, and the quiet beauty of love that persists, even when it cannot be fully realized in the way we once imagined. And as she walked slowly to the window, watching the night settle over her garden, she felt a gentle shift within herself, a recognition that Daniel's honesty had not only opened a new chapter for him but had illuminated paths in her own heart that she had long left unexplored, paths that spoke of forgiveness, acceptance, and the courage to feel deeply once more. And she remembered the first time she had met Thomas, the small moments of connection that had felt like sparks in the dark, the way every smile, every shared glance, had planted seeds of hope, and she realized that those seeds, though buried for decades, had never truly died, and now, through her guidance and through Daniel's bravery, they were ready to bloom again in subtle ways, inspiring a renewed appreciation for the fragility and resilience of love. And Eleanor thought about the ways in which humans carry both joy and pain, often intertwined, and how the act of sharing these experiences with someone who truly listens could transform not only the listener but the speaker as well. And she felt a quiet gratitude for the bond she shared with Daniel. A bond strengthened not merely by blood but by the courage to be honest, to expose the inner workings of the heart, and to offer understanding without expectation. And she thought about the future, the choices Daniel would make, the risks he might take, the loves he might pursue, and she felt a profound sense of hope, knowing that whatever paths he chose, he had been given a gift tonight. The knowledge that vulnerability could coexist with strength, that honesty could lead to freedom, and that love, even complicated and challenging, could be a guiding force, a source of wisdom, and a reason to keep moving forward. And as Eleanor sank back into her chair, the warmth of the room wrapping around her like a comforting embrace, she reflected on the small miracles that life occasionally offers, moments that remind us that connection, understanding, and compassion are the forces that truly shape our lives, that the simplest acts of listening and sharing can leave lasting impressions, and that when hearts are brave enough to speak and gentle enough to hear, everything changes, subtly at first, then profoundly. as if the world itself has shifted in alignment with the truth, and Eleanor understood, with a clarity that made her breath catch, that tonight had been one of those rare and precious moments, a night that would remain etched in memory, a conversation that had altered the course of both their hearts, leaving each of them richer, braver, and more open to the possibilities that love, honesty, and human connection could bring. And she knew that the quiet promise of what had been shared, the lessons passed gently from grandmother to grandson, would ripple through their lives in ways neither could yet fully measure, quietly shaping decisions, nurturing courage, and reminding them both that even in the ordinary spaces of a modest living room, extraordinary transformations could take root. And as the house settled into a peaceful stillness, Eleanor felt the weight of the day's revelations settle into a warm, sustaining glow, a feeling of completion yet anticipation, a sense that while the conversation had ended, its impact would continue to unfold, guiding, inspiring, and connecting them in ways that would last far beyond this night, a reminder that life's true gifts are often found in honesty, in listening, and in the courage to embrace love in all its messy, beautiful forms. And as she finally closed her eyes, a quiet smile played on her lips, because she understood that sometimes, change arrives not with fanfare but with a gentle knock, a shared story, a brave confession, and the simple, unspoken promise that hearts willing to speak and hearts willing to hear will always find a way to transform everything.